Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a rarer Saturday show. Now, Churchill is the subject of over 1,000 biographies, more coming out all the time, and yet we seem to be in an era of misinformation about the man and his career. My guest today is doing sterling work, debunking myths and setting the record straight. You've probably followed him on social media or in the press. Welcome to World War II TV, Andreas. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. Long-time fan of the show.
Good. So we were just discussing before going live that Churchill's never going to be not discussed. And you're going to present these 10 facts today. Do you think people are entrenched in their views about Churchill? The people who support him won't be kind of pushed off their position. The people who hate him won't be. Or do you think there are people who sit in the middle and waver and have a more nuanced view of him?
It's a bit of mix and match, really. There's definitely a lot of people out there, I think, who do have a nuanced view on Churchill, partly because they haven't really delved into more of the sort of I'd call them hardliners. You've got people who are very, very, very fiercely pro-Churchill, but to a hagiographic kind of sense.
Right.
And they can't recognize any of the man's flaws. And they put him on a pedestal, which I think he deserves to be put on, but they don't recognize that at the end of the day, he was a man. But on the flip side, and I think the flip side is the far larger minority, shall we say, of people who are shouting online, have villainized him to the point that you've now got people going on, massive platforms and outlets, speaking with people like Tucker Carlson. He's got people on saying that Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. So that we're at the point now where people seem to think that you can come out with statements like that and it's fine, I think is rather concerning. Churchill's reputation has sort of always gone in waves. And we're at a particularly bad point at the moment. But it hasn't been this bad in a while. I mean, you could probably make the case that this is the worst it's ever been. But I would say that on balance, the majority of people out there, I think, still do have a rather nuanced view on Churchill and recognize that he was a great statesman, but he wasn't perfect because at the end of the day, he was human.
And as another thing is, of course, he's come from an entirely different era than everyone around today is from. I mean, he was an elderly man even when World War II was fought, and that is now 80 plus years in the past. So, of course, he's going to come at things from a direction and a point of view that we find different today because we have moved on. The society has taken on different values and culture has moved on. So he does kind of end up representing an entire era all on his own acceptably broad shoulders, but he kind of represents empire and Victorian values. And because he wrote so widely and people discuss him all the time, he's kind of taking the whole burden on board for that entire generation. But you're coming to present these facts, so let's go through these 10 facts that you think are the ones that are worth discussing. And folks, fire away with comments. I don't know how many of them we'll be able to address or questions we'll be able to get to, but over to you for fact number 1 about Winston Churchill.
Thank you very much. I thought we'd start on a positive one, which was essentially Churchill's lifelong sense of destiny, because I think that's once you understand that, you can really understand so much of Churchill's life and so many of his different actions. Because Churchill maintained this remarkable sense of personal destiny. It was sort of this lifelong prophecy that he had, and it was first really visible in the summer of 1891. So for context, Churchill is a school child at Harrow. He's only 16 years old, and he tells his school friend that I can see vast changes coming over a now peaceful world. Great upheavals, terrible struggles, wars such as one cannot imagine. And I tell you, London will be in danger. London will be attacked, and I shall be very prominent in the defense of London. Which for someone to say at the age of 16 in the 1890s you know, it's a very sort of prophetic and powerful statement. But then in that same conversation, which thankfully was later recorded by Sir Martin Gilbert, his official biographer, Churchill tells his school friend, quote, "In the high position I shall occupy, it will fall to me to save the capital and save the empire." For a 16-year-old to say that in the 1890s, when you're still in the time of Pax Britannia or Pax Britannica, you know, the last major threat that the British had, of course, was Napoleon. And we all know how that went. Granted, you had other powers growing. Of course, you had Tsarist Russia. The United States was really, you know, beginning to kick off. And of course, you had problems in Europe. And then, of course, you had the Asian empires. But Britain was still very much, you know, the world power. It wasn't being challenged as of yet, and it wouldn't really be for another good couple of decades. So for Churchill to say that at the age of 16, I think is a really remarkable thing. And he kept that with him his entire life. That he was this man who was destined to do great things and sort of save the free world. And that's partly because he viewed the free world and the British Empire sort of as synonymous things, which we can go into and later on, but and the contradictions in that. But that's sort of Churchill's worldview. And when you look at his war memoirs in the Second World War, speaking of the day that he became Prime Minister on the 10th of May, 1940, he wrote that, you know, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And so that sums up Churchill, really. He had this tremendous sense that he was to do great things. And he got this for two key reasons. Number one, of course, was his ancestry. He was a descendant of one of the greatest, I think, generals in history, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. He was born in Blenheim Palace, which, of course, had been gifted to John Churchill by Parliament under Queen Anne. And his own grandfather was the 7th Duke of Marlborough. Given that he came from such an extraordinary family, he sort of felt that he would continue that excellent legacy. And the second reason, of course, that gave him this tremendous sense of destiny was the fact that the man died God knows how many times. Even in peacetime, you know, he was in so many different life-threatening near-death experiences. From the moment he was born 2 months premature in 1874. For a lot of children back then, that's a death sentence.
Yeah.
At the age of 10, he was stabbed by a school friend. Clearly not a good school friend. He almost dies of pneumonia a year later. And the fact that, you know, for everybody else but Churchill, you'd be put off alcohol because he was prescribed brandy rectally as well as orally.
Oh dear.
So I think he braved that, and he was fine there. But even, you know, a month before he turns 12, he nearly dies in a house fire. And this is all while he's, you know, a school child. Before he's even 20, he almost dies in Lake Geneva in a boating expedition with his brother. And this is just peacetime stuff, you know. Of course, he has two plane crashes, 3 car crashes, but he fights in 5 campaigns over 4 different continents. And everyone knows the famous story of him escaping, you know, the prisoner of war camp during the Second World War. And of course, it was so terrifying that he had to hide in a mine shaft, and he could feel the rats scurrying across his face when the candle let out because he was wanted dead or alive. For anyone else but Churchill, it would have been extremely terrifying. And when you packed all of this in, you can see as to why he really felt that he was destined for great things. And that, I think, sums up the first fact, which I think is a positive one. Now to get on to more of his controversial
just before we move on to number 2.
Yeah.
Interesting that in the audience there, Abraham has said, so did Bonaparte, Cromwell, and Hitler. They had a personal destiny as well. But I'm interested that he's chosen people that far from the negative side of history, because Elvis Presley had a sense of divine, I was going to do great things. I think Audrey Hepburn did. Lots of people from different walks of life have a sense of greatness. But it's interesting that Abraham has linked it to three kind of negative ones. But back in the time, though, people in that 19th century could go on. You could have countries named after. You could literally find places in the world that no one had found before. You could do things that had never been done. Whereas in 2024, it's a little bit harder to kind of go out there and change the world. But in that era, you absolutely could, couldn't you?
Oh yes, definitely. Throughout history, you've got loads of examples of people having these tremendous senses of destiny. Be it from political figures to famous singers to Muhammad Ali. But I do think mentioning those three figures, I think is respectfully, I think rather telling of the position that I think the comment is.
I mean, but this we knew we were going to get that. This is the world we live in. People love Churchill, people don't love Churchill, but that was interesting. First fact. So number two.
So number two, I want to briefly go over Churchill's philosemitism, because this is something that has recently become a controversial topic, even though it shouldn't be. It's essentially Churchill's lifelong relationship with the Jewish people in the state of Israel. I wrote an article actually a few months back, actually maybe about half a year back, for the National Interest, and I called it Churchill's lifelong friendship with the Jewish people, because that's what it really was. Churchill was very different to the majority of people of his aristocratic class and background, in that he wasn't an anti-Semite. He was the opposite. And so he recognized the Jewish cause for liberation. And throughout his life, he championed Jewish rights and liberties at a time when, of course, the Jews, as they have been for the majority of the past 3,000 odd years, have been a persecuted people. And so it was very important, of course, that you had such a politician, such an important figure, to be a champion of an oppressed people like the Jews, especially given what went on in the 1930s, but even prior to that, with the pogroms in Tsarist Russia. And so I'm just going to give a brief background. Churchill grew up with many Jewish role models and friends. One good example is Sir Philip Seaman. He was a neurobiologist and a laryngologist, and he actually helped Churchill with his speech impediment. Lord Randolph Churchill, Churchill's father, was also a philosemite, which helped, and that's how he had many Jewish friends and role models and went on holiday with them, etc. But Churchill, being a member of Parliament for Manchester North, was certainly an important factor. Between 1904 and 1908, he was the MP there, and about a third of the constituents were Jewish at a time when less than the 1% of the British population was Jewish. And you can see Churchill really enveloping himself in the culture and with the people and his constituents, being a member of the Manchester Jewish Cricket and Tennis Club, donating to the Jewish Amateur Dramatic Society, to the Jewish Soup Kitchen, visiting the Jewish hospital and the school. But it wasn't just a case of him supporting his constituents, because quite often you'll have these sort of far right sort of anti-Semites respond to that by saying, oh, but he was only doing that because he wanted to further his political aim. If that were the case, there would be no reason as to why he donated money, for the Benevolent Society for the Relief of Poor Jews from Austria and Hungary. I mean, that's got nothing to do with his constituency. That was in 1904, for reference. We've got a receipt for that at the Churchill archives. The following year, he would oppose publicly the Anti-Semitic Aliens Bill. And even when he's in the Colonial Office in 1908, he says that, I'm in full sympathy with the historical aspiration of the Jews. The restoration to them of a center of true racial and political integrity would be a tremendous event in the history of the world. And so that's, just under a decade before the Balfour Declaration. Of course, fast forward to 1920, and this is a really, really important moment because many Churchill detractors will point to an article that Churchill wrote called Zionism versus Bolshevism. I believe Darrell Cooper also did the same thing. Churchill wrote it for the Illustrated Sunday Herald. It's one of the most out of context taken things I think ever. If there was an award for out of context, it'd probably win it because people try to say, oh, Churchill's generalizing. He's trying, he believes in some Jewish world conspiracy. They try to make sort of Nazi comparisons. No, what Churchill was saying, if you read the article, was that even though many of the Bolsheviks were Jews, few Jews were Bolsheviks. And he began the article by saying, quote, some people like Jews and some do not. But no thoughtful man can doubt the fact that they are beyond all question the most formidable and most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world. He'd be the worst anti-Semite, I think, possible if an anti-Semite's saying that, there's an inherent contradiction there. And of course, from February 1921 to October 1922, Churchill was Secretary of State for the colonies. He visits the Holy Land for the first time and even plants a tree at Mount Scopus. And the following July, the House of Lords votes to repudiate the Balfour Declaration. Churchill gave one of the greatest speeches he's ever given. He deliberately called and took previous parliamentarians' quotes that they had said and used it against them and showing their hypocrisy. And in doing that, he was able to get the House of Commons to vote against and override the House of Lords. By 292 to 35 was the vote, which is a remarkable majority. And were it not for him, as many historians have said, given that pivotal moment on the 4th of July, when he gave that speech and the vote, you probably wouldn't have any Israel today. Britain would have probably given up on its mandate. And it was Paul Johnson, the late historian, who said, without Churchill, it's very unlikely that Israel would have ever come into existence. There's so many other examples I could give, but obviously I don't want to go into it too much, given that we've got more facts to go to. But I think the final thing I do want to mention, just to illustrate this, was how Churchill nearly met Hitler in 1932. People don't really know about this. It's a very forgotten moment in history, which is why every time I do a bit of research or write an article for a publication about Churchill and Israel, Churchill and the Jews, I always make sure to mention it because it's so pivotal. But in August of 1932, so we're talking about 6 months before Hitler takes the position of Chancellor, Churchill is in Munich researching for his book about his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. And he bumps into Hitler's press secretary, Heinsteigl, I always butcher that name, who basically suggested a meeting between the two because there was a hotel that Hitler would visit every day at 5 p.m. Churchill had said that he would happily meet Hitler on the condition that he would challenge his anti-Semitism. So he relayed a message to Heinsteigl saying, quote, "Why is your chief so violent about the Jews? I can quite understand being angry with Jews who have done wrong or are against the country, and I understand resisting them if they try to monopolize power in any walk of life. But what is the sense of being against a man simply because of his birth?" Heinsteigl tells this to Hitler, who refuses to meet Churchill, and Hitler basically says that Churchill was this man of no consequence and a political has-been, and we'd never hear of him again, which I always find so ironic. It's almost poetic. But that sort of, I think, is a good summation of Churchill's philosemitism. There were many examples throughout the war where he, Second World War, where he pushed for a Jewish brigade. He authorized the bombing of the railway lines in Auschwitz. It was the military who turned it down because of how difficult it would be and the low chance of success. Thought I'd just mention that as well, given that people often say that's another sort of accusation against him. No, Churchill authorized it. But the third topic I want to go over is the Bengal Famine, because that's certainly the most misunderstood aspect of Churchill's life. And it's the one that has the most, I think, forward, but also quite aggressive accusations against Churchill. And to provide context, in October of 1942, a cyclone hits Bengal and Orissa, and it wipes out much of the rice crop farm. The War Cabinet doesn't actually find out about the true severity of what's going on when it comes to the shortage of grain until the end of July of 1943. So during that period, prior to that, it's important to remember that the Japanese maintain a fleet in the Bay of Bengal from April of 1942 onwards. Especially the submarines were really dangerous. They would sink lots of merchant shipping. We've got documents from March of 1944 showing the potential, how far the Japanese fleet could actually affect Britain and the Allies. And it encompasses the whole area. And it's not simply just submarines. They were worried about battle cruisers and aircraft carriers, and the estimated area that they thought the Japanese raiding force could penetrate went all the way from the south coast of Burma up right near the Maldives. So if you take a map up, you'll see it's a humongous area that the Japanese were able to threat. And of course, the surrounding areas that previously would have been used to alleviate famines in the region, they had all fallen to the Japanese by sort of mid-1942. You know, Singapore, Malaya, Burma, the Philippines, they were all under Japanese occupation. And so none of those could be used to alleviate any food shortfalls, as well as the fact that the Japanese were bombing, you know, eastern cities. They were invading India in Imphal and Kanpur, and they were bombing the docks, you know, of Calcutta and Bombay. They were bombing. Well, there had been the famine, not the famine, sorry, the actual weather had caused with its cyclone issues in the north of India. When it came to its harvest, it threw the weather out of sync, basically. And railway lines were washed away in the south, and roads and telecoms were damaged. And of course, this encouraged hoarding by Hindu merchants because there was a general inflation crisis, and then there wasn't enough grain. So all of this stuff is what's causing the famine. When Churchill finds out about its severity, he says to him and the War Cabinet authorize in August of 1943 100,000 tons of barley to be shipped from Iraq and 50,000 tons of wheat to be shipped from Australia. Now, Amory, who is the Secretary of State for India, writes to Archibald Wavell, who would soon be appointed the Viceroy of India. And Churchill was really pushing for Wavell to be the new Viceroy because the previous Viceroy hadn't got a grip with the actual famine. And so that was another example of Churchill, you know, trying to alleviate the famine, sort of political change. But nonetheless, so he writes to Wavell that August, explaining, quote, he may come back to the cabinet if that fails to help the situation. And so between August of 1943 to December of 1944, you have about just over 900,000 tons of grain shipped to India, despite the Japanese threat, despite the fact that the Allies were in a never-ending shipping crisis, especially when it came to, you know, the North African campaign and D-Day and all these other military events that were going on. They still managed to try to get over 900,000 tons of shipping sent to India. And a good number of those War Cabinet meetings discussing the famine, not only were they all chaired by Churchill, but Churchill actually summoned the War Cabinet to discuss it on multiple occasions. And he would even ask the United States for help in 1944, but the US turned it down because of their own shipping constraints. So the whole accusation about Churchill and the Bengal famine, it's one that if you go to the primary sources, as I have, you know, I've written about it for Hillsdale College, I've written about it for the National Interest, for the Spectator. I mean, it's even taking up a large chunk of my dissertation, because my dissertation's about Churchill, as one would expect. But it's a very misunderstood topic, and this leads to the next fact I want to go on about Churchill, which is Churchill's views of Indians generally, because it's interlinked, but I think it's such an important topic, you should sort of separate them into multiple facts. Churchill has often been accused of being this extremely cartoonish-like villain against Indians. And people quote a number of quotes given during meetings of the War Cabinet, particularly around the Bengal Famine, to prove this. So the first quote that they often give is one that Churchill never actually said. Apparently, Churchill wrote to Why Hasn't Gandhi Died Yet in response to the Bengal Famine. If you actually read the telegram that Churchill supposedly wrote this, it's nowhere there. Churchill actually says something completely different. The only thing you can find really is that Churchill says, "Surely Mr. Gandhi has made a most remarkable recovery, as he is already able to take an active part in politics. How does this square with the medical reports upon which his release on grounds of ill health was agreed to by us? In one of these, we were told that he would not be able to take any part in politics again." So it's, there's no mention of Churchill writing that comment. It's one of those things that if you just go to the primary sources, it's so easily disproved. The second quote that often is peddled against Churchill is that Churchill famously says, that he hates Indians, that they're a beastly people with a beastly religion. It's obviously racist, it's obviously unjustifiable, but you have to put it into its context to understand what's going on, because if you just look at that quote alone, which a lot of people do, that's where they get these accusations against Churchill. What actually happens is very different, because Churchill had this tendency when he was in the War Cabinet, when he was having a sort of stressful time, and yes, it's not justifiable, but he would have this tendency of lashing out at sort of everybody and anybody when he was having this sort of mental breakdown. Running a world war, obviously, would give you quite a bit of stress. And so when he says that they have a beastly religion, this was in response to him finding out that the Quit India movement had just been launched by Gandhi. And Churchill viewed this as a stab in the back, because he knew that Gandhi and his comrades knew that launching this independence movement would not aid the British in their fight against the Japanese. If anything, it would do the opposite. And given that the War Cabinet had, lots of photographs of, say, Indian newspapers at the time, they all recognized that Gandhi recognized that this would actually be counterintuitive for the fight against the Japanese. Gandhi, for principled reasons, whether one agrees with it or not is separate, but it didn't matter. He thought the main thing was getting the British out. If it affected with the Japanese, he thought that they weren't really going to, I think, cause as much devastation as they actually would have. But Churchill very much viewed this as a stab in the back. And that's why he blurted out such a thing. When I'm going to mention in a few minutes so many other quotes throughout Churchill's life about Indians, you can clearly see that the case I'm making that it was Churchill being overwhelmed is true, because it doesn't fit with the rest of Churchill's quotations about Indians, both before the war and after the war. But the final, most important quote that's used against him is that he says that Indians breed like rabbits, which he said during a meeting on the famine when he had a bit of an emotional breakdown, given that none of it was working. But what a lot of people neglect is that immediately after he calmed down, he asked his colleague Leathers what could be done to help the Indians. If you're going to mention the first part of the quote, which is racist, no one denies that, mention the second part, because it proves what I'm saying, which is that the man had a mental breakdown, said something very daft and stupid in private, which every human has done, but that didn't translate into policy. And we can really see that in Churchill's entire life when it comes to India. And so I'll just spend a few minutes going through some quotes, because obviously we don't want to spend too much time on this, given that we've got more facts to go through. But Churchill first visits India in 1896 with his regiment, the 4th Hussars. And the following year, he joins the Malakand Field Force as a war correspondent. They were operating in the northwest frontier, so now sort of northwestern Pakistan. He was then stationed in Peshawar in early 1898, where he was made an orderly officer. And his travels to India would end in 1899. So he spent a good few years. Obviously, he came back to the UK during that time, but traveling throughout the subcontinent with the empire. And he saw what the British were doing as a force for good. And he wrote in his memoirs that he was proud of the great work which England was doing in India, and of a high mission to rule these primitive but agreeable races for their welfare and our own. And this is what Churchill actually believes. He was a paternalistic imperialist. He was born, of course, in 1874, at the same time that Charles Darwin was still alive. People don't like mentioning this, but it's important to recognize that at that time, the anthropological consensus in the West was that there was a hierarchy of races. Yep. That consensus would not be challenged properly really until after the Second World War. And even then, there would be multiple decades worth of time before the Civil Rights Act would come in the United States. And, you know, as we know, there are still issues going on today, but especially within the scientific world, this sort of scientific view of racism was very much considered scientific fact. Of course, it's ridiculous, but that was the view of the day. And Churchill thought that if this were true, it was Britain's moral responsibility to try and help and uplift the tribes and peoples of the empire. I often say to people, you can call this condescending, because it is.
It is, yeah.
But it's very condescending, but to try and relate that to sort of neo-Nazi, not even neo-Nazi views, actual Nazi views back in the day, in the 1930s, which people try and create parallels to, I think is very inappropriate, because, you know, the Germans within their racial theory, Nazism, thought that if someone was inferior, you could essentially treat them like cattle and murder them and work them to death. Churchill took a very different view. It was completely opposite to that. And so I think that really needs to be remembered. It's not often spoken about enough. People will mention the fact that Churchill, you know, held views of his day, which he did. He was a Victorian aristocrat. But he very much differed from many of his contemporaries because he was this paternalist. And you can see this in the relationships that he had with Indians that he knew. You know, he met the Maharaja of Alwar in 1920. The Maharaja actually recounted that in a letter that we have at the archives that he enjoyed few things more than his conversations with Winston. And he actually hoped that Winston Churchill would be appointed Viceroy of India. And he would refer to him as his dear friend in his letters. And the following year, 1921, he actually, in one of his letters, said, quote, thanking Churchill, quote, for assisting the destinies of my country through her present critical stages. And even in the 1930s, when Churchill opposed the India Act, it was not because he hated Indians, it's because he thought that the devolution of power to India should be a slow process done effectively, so as to not allow for things such as partition or bloodshed or the collapse of physical and social infrastructure like education, healthcare, etc. And again, it's very condescending. No one's denying that, but it's not this genocidal thing. And actually, after Churchill, of course, loses and the India Act does get passed in 1935, he meets G.D. Birla, who's a very famous Indian industrialist, a very close supporter and friend of Gandhi. And Churchill actually invites Birla to lunch at Chartwell. So even though Churchill loses the India Act, he invites this key independence figure to Chartwell. And Birla writes back to Gandhi saying that Churchill was a remarkable man and he had one of the most pleasant experiences with Churchill. He said to Gandhi that he thought Churchill was ill-informed on India, which I would agree with. Churchill certainly didn't get the best information as to what was going on in India at times. But he found Churchill to be a remarkable man. So if Churchill was this evil, genocidal villain, I can't see how Churchill would invite his enemy, if we're looking at it in sort of Nazi-like racial terms, for lunch. And of course, there are many other examples, but we don't have time to go through them. But I'll give one brief final one, which is how Churchill's former butler, when he was in India, died in 1960. Churchill was now at the end of his life, but nonetheless, even though this butler worked for Churchill over 6 days prior, Churchill saw it fit to send his wife, who was living in Bangalore, money every year. You know, he sent her 1 to 2 checks a year of £5 with his best wishes. And given that the last check he sent her was in December of 1964, a month before he died, it was £10. India's GDP per capita at the time, in current US dollars, was less than $120. £10 in 1964 was about £170. So he sent, you know, the GDP per capita per person as a gift. I'll round that off there because it's a very complex topic, but I think that's as quick as I can generally go through the main key points with regards to Churchill in India.
Yeah, and just before we move on, Andreas, it's just that what we said at the beginning is that we can't. The system is bad at the time. The system had clear faults. The state of mind of the West regarding at the time this part of the world, Asia and Africa, was pretty damn bad. But Churchill, within that strata, is by no means the worst. He's got this, as you say, a patronizing attitude towards them. It's a little bit, it's seen him as a childlike in a sense, but hang him, you know, try him for the crime he's committing, not the crimes beyond. He's being condescending, he's being patronizing, he's being a bit belittling, but he's not being an absolute uber Nazi about it. And the whole discussion that's going on in the sidebar about colonialism and empire, that's a fascinating one. And we're in the middle of reevaluating the whole of that, both the British Empire, Dutch Empire, French Empire, Spanish Empire. But Churchill is not the sole figure that's responsible for that era. And within it, as I say, he's by, it's a weird defense, but he's by no means the worst. He's got an attitude where he will sit and have a dialogue with people, which if nothing else, that's something, inviting people to his home, going and discussing with people is to be admired, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely. And one other thing I would say before we move on that's important to remember, of course, is that this idea of a hierarchy of races, which we know to be completely ridiculous, wasn't just a Western thing, which many people forget. So you had many African tribes who believed that they were superior to others. You had the caste system in India, which
India itself,
Yep. And then, you know, if you take Asia, I mean, the Japanese believed in their own Nazi-like view of racial hierarchies, and what they did in China, I think, alone is testament to what I mean with regards to Imperial Japan. So I think that's another important thing to remember. It's not just people in the West, it's sort of everybody. And that's why we have to judge people by the confines of their time. And if you judge people through the lens of 2024, which unfortunately more people are doing, pretty much everybody's going to come across as some sort of villain or bad person. Because in the same way that in 200 years' time, we will come across that way to people in the future.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm well aware that
as moral, they won't. So, you know, times change and people move on.
I'm well aware that some of my shows will be considered incorrect in a few years' time. The language I have used, or guests will, no, you can't say that anymore, and I'm completely accepting of that. That's how language moves on, culture moves on. What is acceptable? The moral compass is always spinning in a sense. So that's normal. But you're doing sterling work in addressing these things. And I just wanted to mention Phil Blood's fantastic quote about quote mining, because few persons turn over the page when they think they've found a damning quote. And that's a very good lesson for us all, is when you think you found that smoking gun, is read the paragraph after, read the paragraph before, read the chapter around it, and look, as you've been doing there, looking at the context as well, I think is a lesson for all of us. But moving on, point number 5.
Thank you very much. Point number 5, I think, is a very important one. It's the warmonger narrative, because you hear it almost all the time when it comes to Churchill detractors, and they try to frame it, particularly people on the far right, tried to frame it that, it was Churchill that sort of was bringing forth the Second World War, and he was this warmonger. And the irony is that it's wrong to say that now, in the same way it was wrong for people in the 1930s to call him a warmonger, because he was actually the opposite. We remember Churchill as the man who warned against Nazism and it fell on deaf ears, which is true. He was the loudest, most prominent figure. But what people don't realize is that Churchill spent quite a lot of the 1930s advocating peaceful resolutions to the problem of Nazi expansionism and Nazi Germany. So one of that, of course, is that you have to be armed. Disarmament doesn't work when it comes to, threatening states. We've got quotes, many of which, one example, in March 1934, he tells the House of Commons, quote, "False ideas have been spread about the country that disarmament means peace." In 1936, April roughly of 1936, Churchill begins writing for the Evening Standard, and he professes in one of his articles, quote, "There may still be time. Let the states and people who lie in fear of Germany carry their alarms to the League of Nations at Geneva." Calling for the League of Nations to try and intervene to create a peaceful resolution with regards to the problem of Nazi Germany is the complete opposite of a warmonger who's arguing, let's all just go guns a-blazing like there's no tomorrow. And he viewed that it would, of course, require pressure from multiple powerful states. And he said, quote, "I desire to see the collective forces of the world invested with overwhelming power. If you are going to depend on a slight margin, one way or another, you will have war. But if you get 5 or 10 to 1 on one side, all rigorously bound by the covenant," out of quote for reference, if anyone's wondering, when he says the covenant, he's referring to of the League of Nations at the time, in the 1930s. Back to the quote, he says, "And the conventions which they own, then you have an opportunity of a settlement which will heal the wounds of the world. Let us have this blessed union of power and of justice. Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him." He's calling for peaceful resolutions, and this is, well into the 1930s. As it got closer and closer, Churchill began to realize that peace wasn't going to be an option, that war was eventually going to come. And of course, he was proven right. But this idea that he was a warmonger, I think, is one that needs to be put to bed. He was quite the opposite. He was very much in favor of international cooperation through what was fundamentally the precursor to the United Nations, being the League of Nations. And that's why after the war, Churchill even says that, "I saw it all coming and cried aloud to my fellow countrymen and to the world, but no one paid any attention." And even during the war, he would tell Roosevelt that when they were thinking of a name, essentially, what should this global conflict be called? And Winston just responded quite bluntly, "The unnecessary war," because he very much viewed it as something that could have been prevented had people just listened to him. That's the
Which
fifth
makes
fact.
complete sense, given that he'd been through wars himself. I mean,
Exactly.
he had seen the very worst of wars, not just the actual acts of military, the casualties, but he'd seen famine, he'd seen civilian losses, he'd seen starvation, he'd seen people's, having to move. So he wasn't someone who hadn't traveled the world, as you made the point, and seen what wars bring about. So I think, and it's also important to remember that from the First World War to the Second World War is a long time. It's, you know, his position over that time is going to be bending and changing. And as you say, eventually, when we get to sort of 38, 39, there's this line in the sand that has to be drawn. But he had been trying to avoid getting to the point where he draws that line in the sand. I think that has been forgotten in this warmonger, that he's in a sense been beating these drums of let's just go and kill this guy for years and years. Because just as you say, it wasn't the case. He was looking at other solutions and eventually goes, okay, no, it's not going to work. Now we must prepare for war. So it's a position that's changing with time and as the situation goes. So brilliant stuff. So next one, are we moving on?
Thank you very much. Next one, so the next few are going directly into the Second World War. First that I want to mention is Mers-el-Kebir, the bombing of the French fleet. This fact is just based on that. It's a topic that is controversial now. It sort of gains a bit of buzz here and there, but it seemed to have resurfaced recently on the internet, particularly on X or Twitter, however you want to pronounce it. I do have a piece that I have been working on for quite a bit of time for Hillsdale College on this. And so this will be, when that comes out, it will be a much more in-depth sort of analysis with all the sources, of course, referenced. It should have been out actually a while ago, but unfortunately I started writing it when I was a bit under the weather. It's been spent a lot of last year unwell, so I couldn't really get all of it done. But it should hopefully be out at some point in the next few months. And to sum it up, people blame Churchill for ordering the Royal Navy to fire at the French fleet off the coast of Iran on 3rd of July, 1940. There's a lot of backstory to this, though, and to go up to it and to explain as to why Churchill was justified completely, in my opinion, for his actions, we have to understand the context. France, in June of 1940, of course, collapses. And the British are extremely worried, as they rightly should be, what's going to happen to the French fleet. If France collapses and the Germans and the Italians demand the French fleet, the ability to threaten British interests and invade, potentially carry out an invasion of the United Kingdom, goes up exponentially. And so prior to the armistice, the British are saying that, you know, if France is going to capitulate, we have to know what you're going to do with the French fleet. Originally, the plan was that neither side would seek an armistice or change of the war terms with Germany unless the other side approved. So on the 12th of June 1940, when the French Council of Ministers instructs the Premier Regnault to seek Great Britain's views of France, pleading for an armistice, the reason they're asking Britain's view is because of that treaty obligation that neither side would commit to something like that without the other side approving. Britain, of course, at that time, naturally, as you'd expect, says that even though we would level no reproaches or recriminations at France, that's a completely different matter for consenting to releasing her from her pledge. The war continues to get worse, and just a few days later, on the 16th of June, Churchill issues a telegram laying out the War Cabinet's decision. And he says, essentially, that though Britain would continue the war no matter what, they would exclude themselves, naturally, from, quote, any inquiry requiring an armistice. However, provided, quote, but only provided that the French fleet is sailed forthwith for British harbours pending negotiations. His Majesty's government give their full consent to an inquiry by the French government to ascertain the terms of an armistice for France. This is really key and important because the British have laid out very fundamentally the French fleet must go to Britain before, if you are going to capitulate. And I think that's a completely reasonable assumption. Churchill's fears, of course, were proven correct because Article 8 of the armistice declared that the French war fleet would fundamentally fall under German and Italian control. They called it supervision, but that's what it meant, control. And so even though Admiral Darlan had promised the British that there would never be a capitulation of the French fleet to Germany, the British rightly recognised it. You simply couldn't count on the words of one admiral. For one, Admiral Darlan had joined the Bordeaux government in the Ministry of Marine. And as Admiral Pound rightly pointed out to the naval commanders-in-chief, after the armistice was signed, he said, quote, "From that moment, Admiral Darlan will no longer have the power, though he would no doubt have the inclination to carry out his promise, and we should have nothing to rely on but German and Italian declarations, which is obviously valueless." Given, of course, by 23rd of June, the communications between the British government and the Bordeaux government have essentially stopped. And of course, they only recognised the de Gaulle government as the rightful heir to France, or to the French governmental system, shall we say. The British very much viewed themselves as very much on the outside. They knew that the armistice was coming and the French fleet wasn't moving. And they were told by Admiral Darlan, basically, don't worry about it. I've sent an order to my people that they're going to scuttle the ships if necessary. Trust me. Unfortunately, when it comes to total war, you can't simply just operate on trust me, especially given that on the 1st of July, which is 2 days before the bombing of the French fleet, the Armistice Commission demands that the French government issues orders for all French vessels in British harbours to return to France. And actually, they issued an ultimatum on the morning of the 3rd of July that if the French government did not comply to this, the entire existence of the armistice would be put into question. So the Germans, these chaps weren't joking around. And so Churchill decided that there would need to be an operation to prevent the French fleet from falling into German and Italian hands, and it was called Operation Catapult. And it was the simultaneous seizure, control, or effective disablement or destruction of all the accessible French fleet. And it took place on the 3rd of July, 1940. It happened in multiple areas across the globe. One of them was in British harbours, because you had quite a substantial fleet stationed there. This was largely peaceful, with the exception of the Surcouf, which was the largest submarine at the time. The commander there refused to give up his ship. And so you did have, I believe it was 4 casualties. But you had a total of 185 ships that were seized at British harbours, all of which were planning on sailing back to France. And I think that's completely justifiable, preventing them from going there. You had 2 battleships, 2 destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 7 submarines. It's a substantial fleet. Granted, it was only a tenth of the French fleet in tonnage, the majority of which was in Africa. But it was still substantial. Of course, you had same day more at the port of Alexandria, but that was a far more peaceful transfer, no bloodshed there. Where you did have the bloodshed was at Mers-el-Kebir.
Yeah.
So anchored off the coast of Algeria. You had a powerful naval task force that was formed in Gibraltar at the end of June, known as Force H. And it was under the command of Vice Admiral James Somerville at the time. And he basically had Captain Holland, who was in charge of relaying his commands on the actual fleet. They issued a telegram early in the morning of July the 3rd at 6:20 a.m., which was a message that was passed to the French admiral who had been there at Mers-el-Kebir. He was a chap called Admiral Gensoul. When people mention the whole bombing of the French fleet, his name often gets ignored. It shouldn't, because as we'll see in about 2 minutes' time, he's very, very important as to what happens next. But the British Admiralty send Captain Holland over. They say, they've sent him over to confer with you. Quote, the British Navy hope their proposals will enable you and your glorious French Navy once more to range yourselves side by side with them. In these circumstances, your ships would remain yours, and no one need have anxiety for the future. The British fleet is at sea off Oran, waiting to welcome you. Jensel actually refuses to meet Captain Holland, partly because he's offended that a captain's sent. So Jensel's sort of playing into this quite wrongly. But the British issue a very reasonable ultimatum, which is sail with us, continue fighting the war. If you don't want to do that, give us your ships. And once the war is over, we'll return your ships to you. And any of the crews that take part, they will be compensated. If you don't want to do any of that, sail to either the West Indies or the United States, places that are neutral where the Germans cannot get them. Or if you unfortunately refuse to do any of these very reasonable offers, please scuttle your fleet. Jensel's response was sort of, to put it politely, up yours. He didn't say that. Yeah. That's what he meant. He refused to take part in any of this. In fact, the message that he sends back to the Bordeaux government, or to Darlan particularly, although we don't think he received it that day, it's very unhelpful. He just says that the British are ordering us to sink our ships. He doesn't actually mention all of the other options that the British gave. The deadline was, of course, to complete it today. The British informed the Jensel that you have to choose one of these reasonable offers, because if not, we're instructed that we cannot let your fleet have any possibility of falling to the Germans. So we will have to open fire on you. They delay by multiple hours the actual deadline because they want to see if they can get the French to perhaps, compromise. But Jensel was refusing to. And Churchill then that afternoon ordered for it to be done. And it was the French fleet was bombed at Mers-el-Kebir. It's a great tragedy, given that a couple of years later, when the Germans tried to seize some of the French fleet, Darlan's promise to scuttle the ship was actually taken out, and Darlan was furious, and he actually wrote to Churchill saying this. But Churchill was completely right in that you cannot simply work on the words of the promises of an admiral who is now under essentially a slave state.
Yeah.
And of course, for the whole preservation of freedom at that point, because if the British go down, then that's sort of it. The world becomes such a dark place. And the options given were extremely reasonable.
Yeah.
And Churchill actually was very worried about how the world would react. But this was the first time in the House of Commons that he won the whole approval of the House. John Colville actually records in his diary the following day, on the 4th of July, that, Churchill tells fellow parliamentarian, this is heartbreaking for me. And after he tells the House of what goes on, the House erupts into cheers. And Harold Nicholson actually writes in his diary that the grand finale ends in an ovation, with Winston sitting there with tears pouring down his cheeks. Winston openly weeps in front of the House of Commons because he feels so guilty that he had to do this. But when you place it into its context, it had to be done. If only the French commanders had been more willing to operate in the same way they had done at, say, Alexandria, where the French fleet there was also blocked off. It's highly possible that could have happened had there been more time. But time was of the essence here. Britain and the Empire were alone. The Germans, the worry of a German invasion was quite high at the time. Of course, we know a few months later, Operation Sea Lion very much becomes a very sort of never going to happen operation because the Germans were arrogant and they planned for it separately. And they were more bankrolling on Britain sort of turning against Churchill or submitting for peace. But at that time, worries of invasion were very high. They were getting intelligence reports saying that potentially the Germans might try and start an invasion soon. Things had to be done, and unfortunately, in war, one must sometimes do distasteful things. But that sums up as quickly as possible, I think, the very complicated day that was the 3rd of July 1940, when we bombed the French fleet.
Well, this is a very good example. Thank you for that. Of how, if you were to condense this story to a tweet, it would sound way worse. Churchill offers the French, scuttle our ships or we'll bomb you. They bombed them and they killed 1,300 Frenchmen. I mean, in that sense, it sounds really terrible. But when you expand it all to the communication, the French admiral, that it becomes a much more nuanced story. And it's interesting living in France. It's something that France has now completely come to terms with its Vichy culpability, and I can go and turn the television on right now. There'll be some documentary about Vichy and how terrible Pétain was, but it was something that the French found difficult to understand maybe 20, 30 years ago, but they've kind of moved through this now. And interesting, it connects with what Damon Lewis said last night about June 1940, a month earlier, was when Churchill gives the commando order. This is that summer is his realization is this is total war. You said the expression yourself. Now the Allies have to fight this war with the gloves off, because otherwise we're going to lose it. The Nazis, the Axis are doing things in an underhand way, and this is no time for civility, in a sense. Although he's still trying to be as diplomatic and give us options. But at the end of the day, as you said there, we cannot allow that French fleet to go into German hands. The Italian fleet and the German fleet, with some French ships as well, in 41 is a dangerously situation for the Allies. So thank you, very well explained. So next one, number 7.
Yeah, I think Bomber Command will be the next topic that I want to go into. It hasn't really been a controversial thing too much. People often, when they talk about Bomber Command, they'll go more to Sir Arthur Harris or Bomber Harris, but especially since the recent Darrell Cooper train wreck interview on Tucker Carlson. There's now been this surfacing idea of what Cooper makes, which was that Churchill was basically committing these great, he called it gigantic terrorist attacks on German cities in 1940. And so now online, I've seen that there's this sort of bubbling surgency, especially on the far right, that, when you look at, say, the German bombing of the Blitz, it was justified because the British did it first, and the British did it on a more evil scale in 1940, and that's largely because this Darrell Cooper figure says that was the only way they could fight back. Of course, this is complete ridiculousness, because Bomber Command in 1940 was too small to actually consider just doing aerial bombardment for the sake of it. It was very targeted bombing because it was a lot smaller. This doesn't mean that they were completely accurate at the time. We know that when you look at the reports, especially in 1941, such as the Butt Report in August of 1941, we know that Bomber Command had a low accuracy. During night raids, the proportion of British pilots bombing within 5 miles of their target was only 1 to 3, which is quite low overall in Europe. In Germany, specifically in the Reich, it dropped to 1 in 4, and there are certain places like the Ruhr where it's 1 in 10. So yes, we know that there was low accuracy, and that, of course, will incur civilian casualties. But this idea that's peddled that Churchill was launching these sort of gigantic terrorist attacks to just bomb the Germans in 1940 is completely false. What happens is that the main priority at this point for Bomber Command is to hamper the German war economy. And that means stuff like oil supplies, communications, industry, factories. It's trying to reduce that. And also, of course, potential areas and infrastructure used for an invasion, such as, on the coast. river barges, for example, which could have been used for Operation Sea Lion. There's loads of examples in the War Cabinet papers themselves. And the reason I want to say the War Cabinet papers themselves is because it means that these were papers that Churchill himself was reading. Because not everything that was coming out of Bomber Command would go directly to Churchill, because, of course, he couldn't see every single paper that was going on. But the War Cabinet would get weekly updates on the naval, military, and air situation. And if you take just one example, August 8th to 15th of 1940, it's all about bombing key German infrastructure. Some of the examples that they bombed were oil plants, aluminium works, and airframe factories. And even when you go to the Chiefs of Staff Committee in early September of 1940, they fully say that our program of air expansion cannot come into fruition until 1942. Churchill and the War Cabinet don't seriously discuss as a proper policy the idea of aerial bombardment over German cities as a primary purpose until the summer of 1941. And this is after the 8th month bombing campaign that was the Blitz. Prior to that, it was very much focused on industry and trying to hamper a German war machine. It was very ineffective given how small Bomber Command was. And it's certainly true that sort of 42 onwards, the primary purpose for lots of the bombing raids wasn't any more infrastructure. That was usually always an important factor. But now quite often you'd have the primary purpose being to also affect German morale.
Yep.
And so if you're talking about by 1942, when you're talking about bombing campaigns, sure, you're right then. However, that's after a very key period of the Germans committing such acts for a prolonged period of time, which they had done since the beginning of the war. People seem to ignore what went on in Poland in 1939, or they ignore in May of 1940 the Rotterdam Blitz, for example, or just the Blitz over the UK. So this idea that Churchill sort of started the bombing of civilians is completely false. It's annoying for me as a Churchill historian seeing that really in the past month or two since Darryl Cooper did his ridiculous interview, that sort of bubbling up. And I think it really does need to be cleared up because that wasn't simply the case. They often point to when the British bombed Berlin. They ignore the fact that Churchill gave the order to bomb Berlin because the East End, because London essentially had been bombed. The general understanding is that it was accidental bombing. But nonetheless, given that London had been bombed, Churchill ordered in the evening towards the end of August to bomb Berlin. It wasn't very effective. The first night, as far as I'm concerned, did very little damage. A few nights later, you ended up having, I believe, 8 civilian casualties. And so even though the damage was low, of course, it had a very big effect on German psyche. And Hitler especially was furious because, for a lot of German people, it meant the war was coming to them now. But people like Darryl Cooper will point to that example, ignoring the fact that it was a retaliation. And that sums up for me really this fact about Bomber Command. But it leads into my next fact that I want to talk about, which is a very quick topic, but it's Dresden, because I see that mentioned very, very frequently, many, many times. In one actual hit piece that was done for an Indian publication, I think a year ago, a journalist was actually basically complaining about a thread I made about the Bengal famine, saying that I'm essentially a charlatan, that I'm not reading the sources or whatever, which I find ironic. But even then, in that article, which was done, I think it was for News 18, they mention, Dresden. And it's a very frequently peddled thing. Dresden, of course, isn't actually Churchill's directive, which many people don't know. Churchill definitely approved of it.
Yeah.
But if you're going to make the case that, it was pesky Winston, actually, no, it was signed off by Clement Attlee. Churchill was away for Yalta. That's the first important point. Doesn't mean that Churchill wouldn't have approved of it, but it's ironic that a lot of these people who hate Churchill use that as their frontline defense. sort of attack against him when it was actually Attlee's order. The reason that Dresden was such a perfect attack militarily, of course, was that everything that could have gone right for the Allies did, and everything that could have gone wrong for the Nazis did. The Nazi regional leader didn't build any bunkers for the civilians. He only built it for himself and for his immediate family and staff. Because Dresden was viewed as such an important cultural hub, the Germans were arrogant to the point that they thought the British or the Allies would never bomb them. So it was virtually defenseless. There was virtually no anti-aircraft infrastructure there. The weather, of course, for Dresden had been far better than it had been for other bombing campaigns. And the fact that there was no resistance from the German side, next to no resistance, given their arrogance in thinking Dresden would never be touched, it meant that pretty much both the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force were able to inflict great damage. And you had about 20 to 25,000 civilians die. Sometimes online I see people saying, oh, you know, Churchill killed 200,000 Germans during Dresden. I know that there must be neo-Nazis because the 200,000 figure is what Goebbels came up with. German military historians after the war all agreed it's about 20 to 25,000. So for anyone watching, if Dresden comes up and you hear the 200,000 number being peddled, you already know that you're dealing with someone who's quite literally bought into Nazi propaganda. Of course, Dresden did have military objectives as well. It was clear that civilian morale was more of the primary target, but you did have military targets as well, factories, but also the fact that it was demanded by the Russians, another fact that people seem to ignore, because it was a railway nodal point. So troops who were fighting on the Western Front, who were being moved to fight on the Eastern Front, were going through Dresden. And that's an important thing I think people need to remember. And so if you're going to attack the policy of aerial bombardment, number one, you can't simply place it just on Churchill, because by the point in total war, you know, we know when the war ended. They didn't at the time. The Battle of the Bulge, if you look at Dresden, was only a month and a bit prior. It had ended, and you had lost tens of thousands of troops there. There were, of course, talks about, you know, German advancements in the atomic bomb. Obviously, of course, thankfully for us and the free world, Hitler rather stupidly preferred to just focus mainly on traditional warfare, not inventing that new technology. So not as much resources went into that when it came with the Germans. Thank God. But of course, the Allies didn't exactly know that. So there was talks of such a thing happening. And the war had to be brought to an end. And so I think you can make the case, given that Dresden, at least its rationality is excusable. I know it's debated by historians whether they would argue it's justifiable or not. I fall more on the side where I say, given everything, you could actually argue it was. But either way, simply pinpointing this on Churchill as deliberately being this cartoonish villain is a ridiculous point.
I mean, ultimately, Churchill isn't an autocrat. There's a war cabinet. There's the War Office. There's the RAF Bomber Command. You know, Hitler and Stalin can effectively decide a complete policy themselves without even signing a document. But Churchill has to go through a system. Of course, he has massive influence. Of course, he oversees things. He can give the go-ahead things. But this is that kind of simplistic comparing him to Hitler, comparing him to Stalin. He's operating within a system that he doesn't have ultimate power. He has huge power, but not ultimate power. And you know, there's been conversations in the sidebar. Dr. Phil Blood has different opinions about Churchill and Bomber Command, but that's strategic bombing as a concept as well. We're going back to this original idea of Churchill. Churchill is being blamed for things that are policy of the Allies in this part of the war. You know, we can only accuse him of what he was directly responsible for, if indeed he was. But as I just said, that he's part of a system. So it's I know we can, and the debate about how the Allies use strategic bombing is an ongoing one that I'm in constant flux about, as I suppose you are too, because it is complicated, it is nuanced, and Dresden and Forsheim and things like that do raise questions. But yeah, it's putting it all on Churchill's plate is interesting. But yeah, brilliant stuff. Moving on, number 9.
Definitely, yes. And just to add something quickly in relation to a previous point that I made, because it actually interlinks with what you've just said, particularly when you look at, say, Churchill and Israel and Churchill and philosemitism, the second point. I briefly mentioned how, of course, Churchill gave the order to bomb the railway lines at Auschwitz. And, of course, it was turned down by the military chiefs because of how difficult. It's very difficult to bomb a railway line because you've got to do it at a particular angle, and if you miss it and the bomb goes off, pretty much everything else is going to miss. And secondly, of course, it was right at the edge of the ability for the planes to reach. And of course, the success rate would have been extremely low, and that's why it was turned down. Had Churchill been this autocratic dictator, it wouldn't have been turned down. He would have given the order and it would have just gone through, and it wouldn't have been successful, but it would have gone through. And Churchill actually says to Anthony Eden on that topic, he says, you know, invoke me if you must, when he says to give the order. And as Sir Martin Gilbert, Churchill's official biographer, notes, he'd never seen Churchill ever give something so quick and definitive. And even then, it was still turned down. And that sort of just leads into when people try and say that Churchill was this sort of dictator of the war. He wasn't. Yes, he had a lot of influence, not just because he was Prime Minister and Minister of War, but there were systems in place. And even in situations where he could override the war cabinet, you know, if all of his chiefs of staff disagreed with him, he wouldn't, even though constitutionally he could. And that was something that he learned partly from Gallipoli. But I think that's a separate side point that I didn't plan to have in my 10 facts, but I think it's a very nice little segue to have, because quite often you'll hear people accuse him of being this sort of dictator, which is obviously ludicrous. And I think the points that we've just given kind of prove that.
Yeah, thank you.
The next point that I want to briefly go over is with regards to Churchill in his younger years in office. He's often accused, rather falsely in my opinion, of being this man who sort of hated the working class. And the reason that they give this is because of the Welsh miners' strike. For a bit of context, though, oftentimes, and this is something that you'll sometimes hear on the more on the left end of the scale. I don't really like the term left and right. I view it as simplistic, but we'll stick with it anyway.
Yep.
Churchill, of course, has detractors from both ends of the political aisle. Those more on the far right will take the more sort of anti-Semitic, warmonger perspective. But those on sort of more on the far left will take this idea that Churchill was this, because he was an aristocrat, because he was this, you know, very important. They view him as much more wealthy than he actually was, but he was a wealthy man, even though he spent his money awfully. All of that factored in, he was this the epitome of what they call the sort of capitalist pig, and the actions that he did with the Welsh miners in Tonypandy sort of completely venerates and supports what they're saying. However, the Tonypandy riots that went on is a very misunderstood thing. Churchill had been Home Secretary in 1910 to 1911. And he had sent troops in to, the idea is that he sent troops into striking coal miners in the Rhondda Valley. And it was because he hated the strikers, and it had gotten very violent and people had died. The truth is starkly different. What happens is that in Tonypandy in Wales in November 1910, you have a coal miners' strike in that valley. And it grew out of a dispute between, obviously, the wages for working hard and soft coal seams, and also when it came to worker protections, particularly when it comes to safety issues. And so as far as we're aware, about up to 30,000 miners went on strike. And the local authorities appealed for soldiers and troops to be set in to deal with the strikes, partly because some of the strikes got quite violent and there was quite a bit of rioting and looting. And so on November 6th, 1910, you have a chap called William Abraham. So he was a member of Parliament, but he was president of the South Wales Miner Federation. And he actually went to the Home Office and he pleaded with Churchill for troops not to be sent. That's the first part. So you have him go to Churchill, say, please don't send in troops. Churchill the next day meets with the Secretary of State for War. At the time, it was a chap called Richard Haldane. And they together decide to dispatch police constables, but not dispatch troops. This is a very fundamental thing that people ignore with this fact. Churchill viewed the use of troops for what was essentially civil disobedience and a civil issue as wholly inappropriate. Churchill actually goes a step further than that, which people ignore, because if he was this sort of capitalist pig that many on the far left make him out to be, if he was this sort of very hating of the working class, it makes no sense that Churchill promised the strikers that he would meet with the Board of Trade. And he would have not meet with them, he would have an immediate Board of Trade inquiry. And he sends them a very clear message, which was that their best friends here are greatly distressed at the trouble which has broken out and will do their best to help them get fair treatment. But rioting must cease at once so that the inquiry shall not be prejudicial, and to prevent the credit of Rhondda Valley being impaired. Confiding in the good sense of the Cambrian workmen, we are holding back the soldiers for the present and sending police instead. Ironically, the press, more on the conservative end of the aisle, particularly the Times, attacked Churchill. They viewed him as he was someone who was unable to, quote, understand that an acute crisis has arisen which needs decisive handling. And later saying men's lives are in danger, not to mention the poor horses. The liberal press, in contrast, favoured Churchill's restraint. Manchester Guardian, quite famously, and this is something that places like Hillside College, for example, have picked up on, they mentioned how Churchill said, quote, the brave course was also the wise one. So this idea that Churchill just sent troops in and there was this massive bloodshed and everything that went on is wholly false. Churchill deliberately wanted restraint, given what was going on. Given, however, that there were riots, he did approve the police constables, but they used the baton, no one died. This idea that Churchill had, some people say 2 people died, no one died. Some people say that Churchill had ordered them to be shot in firing squads, is utterly ridiculous. I think the worst example ever given was that someone argued that Churchill sent Spitfires in, which I thought was amazing, because if Churchill had Spitfires in 1910 and 1911, I wonder how they disappeared and weren't invented for another 2 decades.
Time travel, aliens.
Time travel. I mean, pesky Churchill, it must be time travel. But no, that's...
as silly as that is, that does illustrate how ridiculous some of the Churchill bashing gets. And indeed, some of the Churchill see no faults in him gets on social media. It can get to the point where there's no sensible debate. People are just entrenched in that he's a murderer, he's a racist, or he's the greatest human being that ever lived and he's something akin to a god. And it's like, no, neither of those facts are true. Let's look at this and always, as you've been doing, look at in the context, look at what his decisions were, look at what his options were. And yeah, this is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And this goes back to, I think, very big problem on the debate on Churchill is not recognizing that there can be nuance. In that, for example, I make no aversions that I view Churchill to be a great man. I've come out publicly in the past, even in some of my articles that I've written for publication, saying that I view him as the greatest man of the 20th century. And I still would say that, and I have my defense for that. And for example, part of that would be, you know, how he was the epicenter of the campaign of resistance against Nazism. And that, you know, if Britain and the British Empire capitulated or sued for peace, you'd have a geopolitically isolated United States, you'd have a European-run fascist continent. The Nazis would have probably taken the whole Eurasian front of the Soviet Union rather than holding back forces and key infrastructure to fight the British. I often say that North Africa would have probably become fascist Italy's playhouse. The world would be so dark and, you know, whatever. And a very, very different world had it not been for Churchill. And I do genuinely believe that Churchill was at the epicenter of the campaign of resistance. Doesn't mean that there couldn't have been other people who could have done that, but he was the man at the hour who did so. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that I pretend he's flawless. So I recognize, you know, Gallipoli, the fudging of the gold standard, women's suffrage. Bit of context, he didn't actually think that women were inferior to men. He was worried that they would vote for the Tories, and he was in the Liberal Party at the time. But still, women's suffrage. The abdication crisis. He was quite...
backs the wrong horse there, doesn't he, really?
Backs the wrong horse there. But thankfully, by the point of the Second World War, when, of course, the then retired King, Edward VIII, who's no longer king, refuses to come back to the UK, or, you know, to fulfill his royal duties, Churchill has takes a very different position on him then, fundamentally almost threatening to court-martial him if he doesn't obey what he needs to do. But of course, he was on the wrong side there. And even on the India Act, he was on the wrong side there. Of course, he had his paternal reasons, so it wasn't this, again, evil thing. But yeah, people are people. No one's perfect. People make mistakes. People make blunders. People have views that we don't hold today. Doesn't mean that historical figures can't still be great people. But it doesn't mean that it's a binary. As
we're in an environment where Darryl Cooper and Tucker could say that effectively he was a greater villain than Hitler. I mean, that's just absurd. It's absurd, and it's insulting and ridiculous. You know, absolutely, he's a flawed character. There are sticks with which we can beat him that are legitimate reasons to question his decision making. But for goodness sake, keep it in with the realms of reality. You know, that Hitler and Stalin were way worse people. And yeah, to take it to an extreme where you start saying he's a warmongering greatest villain in history is just it's absurd. But you're clearing things up very well. But we've got one more point to go, I think, haven't we?
Yeah, one more point. This is a much quicker point. It's based, I just wanted to cover briefly, because Channel 4 recently did a new documentary called Churchill's Secret Apartheid. Now, the documentary that Channel 4 did, to mention the positive, is that they do, quite importantly, highlight some of the issues that went on when Black American troops arrived in the UK and how they were treated, particularly by fellow American troops who were white, obviously given segregation and racial issues in the US. That is something that doesn't get spoken about enough. And so I'm all for mentioning that. It's important. However, what the documentary kind of does is it sort of puts forward this idea that Churchill very slyly and sort of secretively went forward with sort of US segregation, US policy on race. And the truth is actually far more complicated than that, because whilst the British recognized and said that they wouldn't interfere with the United States racial segregation policy, which, of course, without question, we can condemn the Brits for. The very big difference is that Churchill had a very different view to how the Black and coloured troops, as they were called at the time, should be treated in the UK. He chaired a meeting on the 13th of October, 1942. And in that meeting, it states, after they said that, you know, they wouldn't object to the US's policies of segregation, which of course we should criticize, they said, quote, "They must not expect our authorities, civil or military, to assist them in enforcing a policy of segregation." War Cabinet then goes on to say in its conclusions, quote, it was clear that so far as concerned admission to canteens, public houses, theatres, cinemas, and so forth, there would and must, I want to make that an important point of the quotation, they must continue, be no restriction of the facilities hitherto extended to coloured persons as a result of the arrival of United States troops in this country. This categorically shows that Churchill was going against what the whole documentary has been implying and suggesting vis-a-vis American segregated troops. And I think this is a very important point that needs to be made, because yes, the British, especially given how much they needed the US as an ally, especially in sort of 42 and 43, they didn't push back in objecting the way that the Americans ran their own sort of system. And that, of course, includes segregation. However, they did push back when it came to the Brits enforcing it, but also when it came to general cultural and recreational activities. Again, as I said, public houses, cinemas, so forth. They pushed back on that. And they pushed back on that quite strongly. There shouldn't be any difference, in the treatment as things currently are. And I wanted to mention that brief point because even though the quote itself is quite quick and it sort of summarizes what was going on, is because I think it translates into a general problem that we have with evaluating Churchill today, is that because we know that Churchill believed in a hierarchy of races because he was alive when Charles Darwin was alive, I think people are now trying to focus and imply and press more in aspects of history, saying that Churchill had greater involvement in prejudice and discrimination in certain policies and acts and during certain political governments, etc., than he actually did. Good example would be this. Other good examples of stuff I've spoken about earlier today, for example, India. And I think if we're going to try and put Churchill in his proper context and say, look, he believed in the hierarchy of races, he was condescending, it was, of course, it had some element of prejudice to it, obviously, because he believed in a hierarchy. That's perfectly fine. Does that mean he wasn't a great man? No, because you have to judge him by the confines of his time, but also by his contemporaries. And his contemporaries were some pretty bad people. And that just goes to show how bad the world was. I mean, the world's still pretty bad. But when some of the greatest, and I don't mean best, I mean as in most influential figures of the 20th century, when you've got the likes of Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, etc., when that's the caliber of people that we're talking throughout the 20th century, you've got to place Churchill in context to that. And he, of course, was very different. And I thought that would just be a nice way to round off.
Absolutely. There's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of being, openly, actively Ku Klux Klan kind of racist, and then there's kind of passive. I don't particularly like. I mean, like we're going down a massive rabbit hole, but people who homophobic people who burn down buildings are different to people who I don't particularly like it, but it goes on outside of my world. That, I mean, this is not the same subject, but it is. Yeah. That period was a difficult one. That whole Victorian-esque period is one that we will have to confront globally. We are confronting empire. We are confronting institutionalized racism. These were things that were going on at that time. Is Churchill the embodiment of that? I don't think he is. He shows signs of the era he was in, but was in some, as you've been articulately saying, was a better man in many ways than most. But that doesn't, it's in a weird way, the bar was set quite low at that time because it was institutionally a period when the class system, the race system was accepted, so it comes down to this idea of judging him by the standards when he was, rather than by today's 2024, which again will be changing in 100 years time. In 100 years time, we will be considered
exactly.
whatever will be considered. racist or xenophobic, whatever it would be. So it's fantastic. Basically, to sum it up, people want you to come back to talk about Churchill's relationship with Alan Brooke. There's Australian viewers saying, can we talk about his complicated relationship with Australia? There are clearly a lot more things we can discuss with Churchill than these 10. There are countless talking points, but it's been a fantastic a conversation, and it's got people thinking. So I'll say thank you very much for joining us, Andreas, and I've put the link into a couple of your social media presences and your articles, things like that, and keep on fighting the fight of getting people to look at primary sources, look at the history. They can still have different opinions, but don't just necessarily believe every tweet you read by every radical. I think is a good lesson.
Thank you very much for having me, Paul, and thank you everybody who listened. Very big fan of the show, as I said at the beginning. It's been a privilege coming on, and if people want me back on and you'd want me to return, I'd be very honoured to do
we'll do that at some point. Jan Smuts came up in the conversation, another talking point there. So there's so much to talk about.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, folks, I'll be back on Monday. We start our Walcheren or Scheldt Estuary week. 2 shows on Monday, 2 shows on Tuesday. Lots more coming your way. Click, like, and subscribe. Buy my guest books. But I'm going to see you all after Sunday. So see you all on Monday. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.